Go.
Hi, do you want to see me being disliked by atheists and believers again? Do you want me to do it again? Now guys, today we're going to talk about a very interesting topic, and it's our favorite one, Jesus. So let's go with the song, Wes. So today, who screwed up my presentation, guys? You were not even supposed to be here. Anyways, here you are. And today I wanted to start. Oh, they left. They abandoned me again, as usual, evil people. So, guys, for everybody watching right now, today I wanted to start this presentation with this book called Jesus Myth in Action. Interesting one because it's related to today's topic, in which we are going to be talking about Jesus. Was he real? Was he a mythical character? But someone, I'm looking at you, Wes, had to ruin it all for me, and now I cannot use the book. Why? Well, because instead of the book, we got Mr. David. I'm not going to pronounce your last name. How are you, sir?
Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald.
I'm sure it sounds beautiful in English, but Spanish speaking here, it's hard for me. So, thank you so much for being here. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and why I was going to quote you, apparently.
Yeah, well, I'm delighted to be here. Probably because I've written a few books on the historical Jesus. I'm most famous probably for a book called Nailed, that's called 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All. And the follow-up book is this 3-part book called Jesus Mything in Action. And as we speak, I'm finishing up another 3-part book called Playing God, an evolutionary history of world religion. And so I'm very excited about that, but equally excited to be here talking about Jesus and why we have reasons to think he might have not existed at all.
Interesting. Very, very interesting, because I'm sure the next person has some stuff to say about that. And thank you for the presentation. I will show it later. Mr. Mark Peralta, I really like you because you and I have worked together for a long time, and you kind of have information about the real Jesus and the Bible. I don't know, maybe you should talk about that.
Well, it's good to be here, Teo, and it's good to be here with you guys. Honestly, I think in the presence of Dr. Fitzgerald, I will be like a fly on the wall today because I know nothing. Honestly,
for starters, I'm not a doctor. I'm just a guy like you. No worries.
Yeah, don't humble yourself, Mark. If somebody should be humble, that's me, but my ego is too much, so I'm going to be like I'm the superior guy here only because I can hold the microphone. And talking about superior people that I really like and awesome people, dear Alma, please join us in this conversation. Actually, you know much more about Jesus than I do, Alma. I have realized that lately.
Hello. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. Well, so far, what I have been learning with, working with you, with Mark, and everything, has been very interesting. But I think to me, the Jesus history has becoming like like the fish that my uncle caught in 1976. It was like 1 feet when he caught it, and now it's like 10 meters. So yeah, I'm kind of like that.
Yep. Yeah, actually, that's it. So, for people who don't know, I'm going to make a short introduction. Oh, look at that cat. Miren a Semichi. Yeah, they are awesome.
We may have some more cat special guest stars today because there's 10 of them in the room with me right now. So
this episode is getting better and better. That's awesome. Okay, for the general public, and hi Maya, I can see you there. There is an interesting thing about Jesus going on in here because, as you know, Jesus is going to be the idea of the Bible, this superhero that is Jewish and who is God at the same time and mortal and all of that. And a lot of people think that, yeah, Jesus is the Son of God. It says in the Bible. Well, we know that the Bible has a lot of stories and we know how it has written, so we can put that to doubt. However, something that is that usually is not doubted is that there was a guy named Jesus and he was crucified. But nowadays there are a group of people. Please correct me, guys. They are mythicists who say that
This is
mythicists who say that Jesus actually never existed and that he was the tale worked backwards. Like first there was this idea of Jesus, and then people decided to say, "Oh yeah, of course there was a guy named Jesus. I know him. He was there. He was there." And that's why we are having this debate today. And of course, I'm going to start with David because apparently he's in strong, he's in one of those sides with a strong view about it. I don't know, David. Do you want to tell us?
Yeah, if you want to start. I mean, there's nothing implausible about there being a guy named Jesus. There's nothing unrealistic about the thought that Christianity might have started with just a single guy. The only thing is when we look at our evidence, the more it looks like Christianity didn't begin like that. And in fact, even if we just go outside Christianity and look at other religions, you see the same kind of thing happening in Judaism and Islam and Buddhism and all the major world religions. It seems to me the more I study that it's the norm for major world religions to start with a purely mythical founder figure. And in my first book, Nailed, I do talk about some things that what would be different in the Bible, what would be different in first century if there was just a guy named Jesus. And again, there's nothing implausible about it, and it's really no skin off my back whether there was or wasn't one, because we can account for the way Christianity began, whether there was a real Jesus or that it was just a Jesus that was preached about.
Well, before I let Mark go with this, because I'm sure he has a lot of things to say, dear Alma, can you help me with the presentation again, please?
sure. Going.
Okay, so I'm just quoting here. The existence of a historical Jewish preacher and the existence of the Jesus of the Gospels are not the same thing. I wanted to start with this specific idea, partly because of what David mentioned, and second, because of this. We know that the Bible actually has characters that are mythical, that they are not real. I mean, the Pharaoh from the Exodus doesn't even have a name, and there is no real Pharaoh recorded who had to go through all these plagues and stuff like that. Yeah. Oh gosh, the picture looks terrible, but down there is supposed to be Abraham about to murder his son. Yeah, and we know that he was a mythical character, despite him being the reason why the whole religion has the name, Abrahamic religion. And Moses back there about to murder our dear beloved Pharaoh, he also was a mythical character who, as we saw in our last episode with the guys that we were checking, he was talking about his own death after he died. So we know that there's a very strong mythical element in the Bible. We do have at least 3 characters, well, 5 in here, but some of them were cut off by the stupid presentation. But yeah, we do know that there are mythical characters, Adam and Eve, that never existed, and people take them for granted. And I think that's one of the main reasons why this I don't want to call it like argument or fight. It's just this idea, contradictory ideas of was there a mythical Jesus? Was there a historical one? Happens. But I think we also have some extra evidence that I will show later about the historical Jesus. But dear Mark, now that I see you getting comfortable and drinking stuff, do you want to say something about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've got prepared for you guys is sort of a brief overview of certain things that perhaps as former believers, like no one really taught us, or we never really heard or read about stuff like this. Namely, how with regards to the stories about Jesus in the Gospels, we as critical thinkers ought to, at the very least, employ criteria similar to what historians would employ in terms of evaluating evidence, so that one can, come to a conclusion whether or not this is likely that it occurred historically or not.
Yeah.
And what the tradition that we've inherited is we ought not to question, because this is the word of God. What's there is true.
Yeah.
So just a brief summary of several criticisms or analyses or things that are part of a historical criteria I think are important to understand. One of those is starting with primary source analysis, which is historians scrutinize primary sources such as documents, letters, diaries, official records, and eyewitness accounts to evaluate the credibility and reliability. They assess factors like the author's perspective, biases, intentions, and the context in which the source was created. So, when we take a look at these gospels, there's a lot that can be said in terms of the source. Um, and so it would take all night to kind of look into this, but I just want you all to understand that this is one aspect of it that we need to take a look at, because everything plays in terms of its credibility. Some of these are more interesting than others, so I'm just gonna kind of give you a definition of some and then get into some examples and others for this for the sake of time. Another is source criticism. Is a method used by scholars to analyze the sources that are used by the authors of the New Testament Gospels to write their texts. A critical view of the New Testament Gospels from a source criticism perspective focuses on identifying and evaluating the sources that may have been utilized in the composition of the Gospels. And this, we've spoken at length in our NuestraExperienciaAtea channel, where we talked about like the synoptic problem, for instance, and how there's an obvious similarity between, Matthew, Mark, Luke.
Right.
And so what does that say about the credibility of each one of these so-called biographies?
Right.
As they're often, heralded by apologists.
Right.
As
even though it's obvious that they're not just similar to each other, they're all stem from each other. Matthew and Luke gospel clearly started with Mark.
That's correct. And that's another one known as Markan priority, which basically demonstrates that's the case.
Yeah.
And then there are others like Q source and L source. These are like just parts of the gospels that like don't seem to share so much, but are perhaps unique to one or the other. But these are very few, far in between.
Mark, what do you think about the Q source? I don't want to get too deep into it, but I'm just curious what you think.
Yeah, I think while there isn't any like material evidence to say, hey, this was a thing, it's very likely that there was something circulating, primarily because if I'm not incorrect, the Q source contains a lot of like kind of oral, what seems like oral traditions or sayings.
Well, for me, I don't see oral tradition. I don't see evidence of oral tradition. It all looks like it's literary right out of the box. And Q, and one of the ones that doesn't, I don't buy the Q thing. I think for the longest time, Q and Markan priority were like attached, and Markan priority's evidence is very strong. But Q, it could be that Q is just those parts of Matthew and Luke, where he's stealing from Matthew and from Luke, from Mark rather. So I'm very dubious about that there ever was an actual Q document.
And then in fact, because of the lack of material evidence, it's just really difficult to say that there was such a thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
But we do have to admit that at the very least, all of that is evidence of like it's a big mess.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And just the fact that of our 4 gospels, 3 of them are clearly based off of the first one, Mark, and the 4th one, John. He doesn't care if he matches the other gospels or not. He's just going off and doing his own thing. So it's funny, like either they're in lockstep with each other or they're completely incompatible. And it's very obvious that like they didn't all start out to set out, oh, the gospel according to Matthew, the gospel according to Luke. They all were setting out to write the one true gospel. And they started with Mark's and said, well, I like this, but we can fix some of the problems with it. We can clear up some of his mistakes and we can add stuff to it. And that's not just the gospels that came, the Christian writings that came after the words.
And that's very interesting what you're saying, David, because that's one of the things that we were learning with Mark and Atheists, because it seems that John like tries to fix some of the things, like the date where Jesus was killed.
Yeah.
Like, this kind doesn't fit, so I'm going to fix it.
Yep.
And
And you
yeah.
can tell he's doing it for theological reasons. It's like, well, no, I want this to be like this, you know. So he feels free to move things around completely. I love the fact that
Yeah.
you guys did a whole series on the synoptics, because there's so much that we learn just from realizing the relationship of the synoptics to each other. That, I mean, I grew up as a Christian thinking, oh, Matthew was one of Jesus' disciples. Oh, Mark was a friend of Paul's, you know, and these guys were eyewitnesses or close to eyewitnesses. And it's like, when you realize, no, they're not. And they don't even, the books themselves don't say they're eyewitnesses. In fact, they say, oh, this was back in the day, and yet we still believe it today. Or Luke says, so many people are setting out to write a gospel, I thought we should go back and see how the stories come down to our generation. So, not to interrupt you, Mark, you're
No, please do add and chime in as much as you need to. I honestly,
fair enough. I just don't want to
greatly
go down
appreciate
too many rabbit holes, because it's like, whenever you start talking about Jesus, you can talk about one thing and all of a sudden, oh yeah, and this and this and this. I'll
For sure.
I'll try to follow your lead without derailing the whole thing.
Sounds good. Teo, you got anything to say before?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to go. I wanted to direct this thing to an interesting point. Because what we usually say, or what I would usually say, I'm going to start just like David. And this is just my opinion. This is what I think, what I've heard, what the experts have told me, and I remember, is that, yeah, Jesus, the mythical creature, the one from the Bible. I always use the example of Abraham Lincoln, vampire hunter. There was a person called Abraham Lincoln, yes. There is a movie called Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter, yes. That doesn't mean that Abraham Lincoln was actually a vampire hunter or that vampires are real. Same with Jesus. There was a guy called Jesus who was crucified. Yeah, most likely. Many people were. Yes. Are you going to interrupt me, David? You can do it. Because I have a counter argument for you.
I missed some of that, but there's one thing. I don't know if you guys know who Robert Price is, but he has a great quote. He's saying, even if there was a Jesus, for all intents and purposes, there isn't one anymore, because everything we think we know about this historical guy who lived comes from people writing stories that have nothing to do with anyone who actually lived in the first century. And that's true whether there was a Jesus or not. What we have is completely unrelated to him.
Damn, actually, that's part of what I was going to say. So, yep, you got it. That was part of my counter argument. That he has been changed, and I'm going to go straight to his death. So, please, dear Alma, if you can show my presentation in here, let me tell you about the Menos graffiti. This was a graffiti that I know that you can attest to it. Before I explain this, what do you think that this was, David? Were they really mocking the death of Jesus, or were they mocking the tale of the death of Jesus? Before I explain it.
Well, this was, if I remember correctly, this was found in a guard post in whichever is it Pompeii or is it Rome?
It was Rome.
Whatever. This was scribbled in a guard post, and what it's saying is Menos worships his god, and that Y above the figure that's being crucified, I almost wonder if that's meant to be like the sound of a donkey braying.
Yes, and I will explain that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the reason is this. You know that we know that the Egypt thing never happens, and there was a pharaoh that had to die under his son died under the plagues and all of that. That's all fiction. And Egyptians know that, and they knew that back at the time because, of course, they have their own history. So whenever, the Hebrew would tell this weird tale about, they escaping Egypt and all of that, of course, Egyptians would mock them. And one of the ways how they would laugh at them was using the god Seth. Seth used to be a great god, but he fell out of grace because of political stuff. And Seth had the characteristic of having a head that was either an aardvark or a donkey. It was kind of weird. These guys started to use the donkey one because it was something that they recognized more than the Egyptians' aardvark. And when they made this graffiti, is because they are mocking the idea that, okay, God is Yahweh. Yahweh for the things that you tell us, Egyptians, yeah, the Hebrew were telling the Egyptians, Yahweh sounds like a very evil god, like this desert god that we call Seth, that was cast outside, who could have reasons to be angry at us. So they were saying that Yahweh was actually Seth, and they were worshiping a false god or an inferior god. And that's why they made this graffiti, because, oh, your god died, and yeah, of course he's God. He's Seth. Here you have it with the donkey head. Because
and this was carved by some guy who works with this guy, Alex Menos, and so he's doing it just to screw with his pal there.
Totally worth it, though. Here we have evidence of at least a guy crucified who said he was a god, and the guy who said this it was like, oh yeah, he's Seth, of course, the Egyptian god that fell out of grace. And there we have this graffiti. I don't know if that guy is laughing at him or just shouting stuff, but
Teo, do you remember what year this was? Was this 3rd century or 2nd century?
I'm going to quickly Google it without people realizing, and I will have the answer right away. You can keep talking, guys.
Okay. Because it's been a while since I've looked at that one, but and how funny is it that, like, of all of human history, one of the only good sources of evidence for a crucifixion comes from some guy scribbling this on a wall. It might as well be in a bathroom for all for
yep.
Oh yeah, like for a good time, call this guy.
For a good time, called Jesus. Yeah.
200 AD.
Sorry, was it
200 AD?
200 AD. Yeah, so right at the 3rd century or so. So this is quite a bit after Christianity began.
Yeah.
So,
and that falls right into my next category of things that historians need to consider for the authenticity of this, because this is part of like material culture. Like, what is it that things outside of the Bible are teaching us about what the people that lived at this time period believed about this Jesus character? And when you look at the evidence, it's confusing, Another example of this, and pardon, I don't have an image of this, but it is known that in the catacombs under the city of Rome, there are some of the earliest depictions of like iconography in a church for Christianity. And as it turns out, the cross or the crucified Jesus wasn't the earliest primary image inside chapels. There are images of fish, and there are other things like
the Good Shepherd,
a shepherd. That's right. Yeah. And go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's one really interesting one where it shows Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, but Jesus has no beard. He has blonde hair, a Roman haircut, and he's using a magic wand to do it.
That's right.
It's really wild.
Yeah. So when considering these things, you've got to somehow kind of weigh all the evidence, both what the scripture is saying and what the material culture is saying. And then another subcategory of this would be like manuscript evidence. Yeah. And I'm not an expert on that, but I do know that when it comes to the New Testament, they call it, apologists use this phrase, the embarrassment of riches. That's what I heard when I was in Dallas Seminary from
yes. Keep going.
Yeah. So, and so, but honestly, like when you look at it, it's just like, it's like a puzzle that has like all these puzzle pieces missing.
Yes.
And there's just thousands of little, and the word manuscript is very, it's very like, how can I describe this? You can use it in different ways. And I think that they're being very crafty when they call these things manuscripts. Because in our modern context, when we hear a manuscript, like if you're a journalist or an author, it's the complete thing.
It's the whole thing. And yet they're talking about fragments that are about the size of a credit card, And that was, and they always say, oh, this comes to like 125 today. They like push the date to as early as it possibly could be. And it's like, no, these are like late 2nd century, early 3rd century at the earliest. And what they don't tell you, it's like, oh yeah, they love bragging about how, we have 20,000 manuscripts of this or 15,000, like so many more than Homer or the Iliad or something like that. But what they don't tell you is that these are medieval manuscripts. It's like
Right.
when you have monks copying them, you might as well have 24 million. It doesn't matter. What matters is
Mhm.
how many of the originals do we have? How many original texts? And by that standard, suddenly Christianity doesn't look so well compared to other things. There's
True.
like 150 to 200 years where we don't even have those little fragments. We have nothing. And that always blows my mind. It's like, let's say the Apostle Paul wrote a letter, threw it in a safe, and we just found it 5 minutes ago. We wouldn't know it was an original. We'd say, oh, this is an interesting alternate variant copy of such and such a book of Paul's. We'd have no way of knowing, if it was real or not. And we have no way of knowing that our surviving fragments and our surviving complete texts, how much they match up to what was originally written. And that's true of Paul. That's true of everybody in the New Testament and the Gospels, for that matter.
Mhm.
There's so many. We have so many variants that literally there's not a single verse of the New Testament that we have intact. We have, and it's like, and I'm not just talking about mistakes, like spelling mistakes, grammar mistakes, scribal errors. That's not special. Sure, they have those, but nobody cares about those. What really bugs us is when we see that somebody has a passage over here that says one thing, and somebody has the same passage and it says something completely different, the opposite. Yeah. Which fragment are we looking at here? Because that's a perfect example of what we're talking about.
I think it says that it was. Let me check. Bible fragment. Collector. I think it says that it was a piece of
P90.
Deuteronomy or something.
P90. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
P90. P90.
yeah.
Yeah.
The oldest fragment we used to think was called P52, and it's seriously about the size of a credit card. This doesn't look too much bigger than that. You can see that we don't even have complete sentences, and it's only one page. And that's generally what we get until like the late second, early third, fourth century, when we start getting complete books of the Bible. And we don't even get a complete New Testament until the fourth century, and we only have two of those, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. And the thing about that is, even though they are our earliest complete New Testaments, they don't agree with each other. Vaticanus has books that Sinaiticus doesn't have, and vice versa. And both of them have books that we don't have. We have books that neither of them have. So it's such a cluster.
Such a mess.
That is the embarrassment.
Isn't
That
it?
is the
Yeah.
embarrassment.
Yeah.
Look, I found also the wand.
Oh, there it
This
is.
one.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, that's not the one I'm thinking of, but that's exactly the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's another one where it shows a different guy, but yeah, you can clearly see he's a Roman Jesus with a magic wand doing the Harry Potter thing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And they have another one here, but it's not as clear as the other one.
Is that the miracle
There it
of? Is that the loaves and
fish
fishes?
and
Or,
the
and look,
bread and the fishes. Yep.
and he's got a magic wand in both of those. Isn't that funny?
Hmm.
Yeah. That's wild. That's wild to me.
I thought it was the flautist of Hamelin, playing the flute.
Oh.
Yeah.
Pretty cool. Neat stuff. Well, Mark, tell us more.
Yeah, so taking it back to the actual source criticism of it all, like the script. There's one book that when I brought this in seminary, it's a textual guide to the Greek New Testament.
Yeah.
By Roger Amundsen. And so what you'll find here is sort of like a New Testament, and it starts from Mark.
Yeah.
And it'll like give you like all these verses where scholars have identified problems with regards to manuscripts. You probably can't read this right now, but I mean, if you're able to get you do need to know a little bit of Greek sometimes.
Yeah.
And but it's just like you're like, wait a minute, this is not credible stuff.
Was it seminary that caused you to become an atheist?
It sort of started like for me to start asking the right questions is what I would describe. But then it took me about like almost 10 years
Oh wow, yeah.
After that, of doing my own independent thinking and researching.
Yeah.
The next category is external documentations. So historians consult external documentation, in other words, extra biblical, such as official records, biographies, histories, illustration, maps, to verify the existence of an event or to establish the context surrounding it. So what I would expect, as anyone else I think should, is to find outside of the New Testament writings, and I would also include writings from like church popes and bishops and church theologians that are like writing about this.
Even just basic church records, and you know, it doesn't even have to be the high end. It could be low end, you know, letters from your just average Joe Christian or anything. It's weird to think that no matter what you think of the historical Jesus, we've got all these letters that come from one dude in all of Christianity from the whole first century. Wild, isn't it?
Yeah, wild. It's because, you know, we're okay with that.
And Fern just made a good point that thumbnails are, what can you bring it back up, Wes? Manuscripts the size of thumbnails is a great way to increase the count. So true.
There you go.
So
yeah. And so what I would also expect in particular would be evidence from actual historians, which what was shocking to me in my, you know, Christian ignorance growing up, is that, you know, in the first century, there were actual professional historians.
There's Philo. Herod's court had professional historians. Flavius Josephus. It's crazy that, especially in the case of Josephus, the same people who are complaining that Josephus really should have mentioned Jesus when he mentions John the Baptist, they're supposedly where we got that passage in the book of Josephus that says, "Oh, and there was this wonderful guy named Jesus at this time," and the Testimonium Flavianum.
That one in itself, it's been questioned.
Both of you have been advancing so fast that you actually ruined my next presentation.
Oh, no!
Shame on you both. Shame on you, dear Alma. Can you show us? No, actually, you're right in the point number 1. There are no contemporary accounts of mention of Jesus. There should be, so clearly no Jesus existed. Come on, the thing ruined the drawing again. Guys, if you don't know, that's how Jesus is describing the Apocalypse, by the way. So I had to bring it here. And this is what you're mentioning. And I was going to ask both of you, what do you think about this? Yes, sir?
We can say more about this. So, Teo, it's good that you're bringing this up.
Yeah. And go ahead, David.
Go ahead, Mark. Yeah.
I was going to say that I'm not exaggerating. I counted 20 historians within that, you know, contemporary to Jesus that did not say anything whatsoever about this very important character. And nothing at all.
And what's more is these are guys who actually had reason to be interested in somebody like Jesus. And what's really blows it for me is that we have all these other loser messiahs in the first century who did make a dent in the historical record. So, like, how do these guys rate when Jesus doesn't? It's like that really blows my mind.
For sure. Yeah. And if you want to look into it, folks, Perseus, Columella, Chrysostom, Justus of Tiberias, Livy, Lucanus, Lucius Florus, Petrinus, Phaedrus, Philo of Judaeus, Phlegon, Pliny the Elder, Plutarch, Pomponius Mela, Rufus Curtius, Seneca, Silius Italicus, Theon of Smyrna, Valerius Flaccus, and Valerius Maximus. These are all professionals, contemporary, that said absolutely nothing. And then we get 4 others that do mention, namely,
like Suetonius, Tacitus,
Pliny the Younger,
and
Tacitus, and then whatever that is being said of Josephus, which I have my own criticism against what they actually do say. Because that's the other thing, that often apologists will say, "Oh, yeah, it was mentioned by Tacitus," but they never tell you what Tacitus said.
Yes, and it's like these guys are talking about Christians, And again, these guys aren't even contemporary. This is like 2nd century.
That's the other thing. Yeah, they're farther out.
Josephus is the closest we get, and he was born after Jesus was meant to have died. So none of these contemporary, even though we had people like Philo of Alexandria, as you say, who would have been interested in something like this. So it's like some people dismiss the whole argument of silence as if it was a fallacy, but it's like, there are times when the argument of silence, when you have reason to expect that they would be interested and were on hand to be able to say something about something, and yet they don't. That's something. It may not be a smoking gun, but it's like this all adds to the preponderance of evidence that that he did not make a dent in the historical record for whatever reason.
There is also something that I wanted to ask of both of you, because when most Christians are always talking about, Flavius Josephus, and he said clearly about Jesus and something, but when I read that chapter, it's so strange because Flavius Josephus is talking about the water, some problem that Pontius Pilatus had with the water, and some other gossip, and then suddenly Jesus.
In the middle of it, bing, yeah. And what's funny is, as soon as he's done with that little commercial for Jesus, the next line is, and then there was another sad calamity that hit at this time. It's like, wait, what sad calamity? We were just talking about how great Jesus was.
Yeah, you figure that would have been like, this is the thing that's going to revolutionize the world, folks.
Yeah. Even though Josephus is a Pharisee and was one of the guys who would have crucified him, it's like, it's so, there's so many reasons why I don't understand why atheists don't stop using that for Josephus. I get why Christians.
I found it here.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
And he's talking about the water, you see?
And this whole passage, this whole passage is like that. It's talking about sad things and trouble and all these murder.
Suddenly, there it is.
And then boom, bingo. And then and it's like we could just dissect every line in here and see how it's problematic too. But one thing is that really blows it for me is that for 300 years, nobody seemed to notice this passage. For 200 years after that, nobody else seemed to notice this passage except one guy, Eusebius of Caesarea, notorious Christian forger, notorious Christian historian who rewrote his history 5 times of Constantine to match political. It's fascinating to me. And again, I get why Christians have to drag onto this, because if you take out Flavius Josephus, that means there's no external witness to Jesus for the entire 1st century.
Yeah, and also if you can notice here, the way that it's written and that a small paragraph is kind of like different of everything else. The way that
absolutely
he speaks in there
absolutely.
It's just like I don't know how to pinpoint it, but it's just different.
No, you're absolutely right.
The way they're talking.
Yeah.
It doesn't fit the literary context of that.
It doesn't fit the context. It doesn't fit anything Josephus would have said. And what kills me is now the guys who tried to defend this, they say, oh, well, it's obvious that Christians mucked around with it later, but there was something original. It's like, dude, the whole thing doesn't fit. None of it does.
Yeah, and I don't know how it's in the English-speaking world, but here in the Spanish-speaking world, they would mention this. And as soon as you mention them that this was added later and you give the explanation and how we know that, they go to a second mention because Flavio Josefo actually mentions another Jesus, or maybe it's the same Jesus, the brother of Santiago.
Yeah, but when you actually
in Spanish it's Santiago, in English is
St. James.
James, okay.
Yeah, but the funny thing about that is that's even more, again, to the point for me. It's like when you read it, it makes no sense if this is talking about James, the brother of the Lord. It makes no sense at all. It makes perfect sense if it's about Jesus, son of Damnius, who the passage says it's about. It's like whoever, all they had to do was slap in who was called Christ and to make it about James, the brother of the Lord. But it's still, you can't change the context of it. Makes no sense. And you can't change the fact that it tells us who it's about. And it makes sense that it was about that guy because he was the brother of the high priest. Suddenly, this makes perfect sense. I don't know why you would bring up this Christian leader at a time when Christians were hated by the Jews. and why, and not explain who this dude is or who this Christ is. Yeah, it's just, it kills me that it's just so obviously, it's not even a forgery. It's somebody put
Just
a line.
type in there, yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, and it's about a completely other dude. And
it talks about their myth, like, oh, he rose appeared to them alive again the third day.
yes, yeah.
But then after he said that, he goes like, oh, about the same time there was another disorder.
Another
in the
sad
temple of
calamity.
Isis.
Yes.
And the
And
temple
it's
of
like,
Isis, like,
whoa, hold the boat. What sad calamity? He's the most wonderful dude ever, apparently. And it says, as the divine prophets had foretold in 10,000 other wonderful things. He doesn't even name any of these prophecies like the real Josephus would. He just, it's so obviously a forgery. Not even a partial forgery. The whole thing stinks. The whole thing stinks. And nobody seemed to notice it for 500 years except this one dude, who we already know is totally shady and dodgy. Yep. I've got a whole chapter on him, so I could talk about just this all day.
Yeah, no, wonderful. And part of what I would then also consider external evidence too, would be how does it compare to other literary works of the time? Like, what actually are the Gospels, really?
Yeah.
Before you go there, Mark, I really have to stop you. Please hold that, because that is going to be a whole new thing that I know we're going to go through. And before we continue, dear Wes, we have a golden question for these two guys that I want them to answer. And I want to talk about something else later. But here, obviously, great guests. I know. Thank you. Oh, you too as well, of course. He was curious. Michael is curious about you guys. Want to know about David and Mark. If you're open to appearing on his live streams or extra stuff, and how they can contact them. I said that Mark is absolutely mine, and you have to go through me and my course to get him.
He's my agent.
Apparently now you also have your own channel that you can promote, don't you, Mr. Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. A positive mind, and it would be my pleasure for sure, Michael.
The same here, Michael.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I was gonna say, you can probably the easiest way to find me is on Facebook, but you can also shoot me an email at everybodylovesdave@gmail.com.
I love that.
Yeah.
Best Gmail ever, and I'm going to search for you on Facebook after this.
Yeah, Michael, I'll be very happy to do that.
Wes didn't answer my question, so I'm going to take his silence as a yes, and I want to show you, dear Alma, can you show our beautiful, beautiful section that we have? Guys, in Spanish, sadly this is only Spanish, we have something called Ateogesis, where with Alma and Mark we talk about the Bible, and we actually went through all the synoptics, after these numbers, all the synopticos, the Lucas, Marcos, Mateo, Juan. In English they are Matthew, Mark, John, and Lucas. Very, very similar. And here we talk about the life of Jesus. Obviously, we know that this first part is BS. It makes no sense. They try to say that he had to go to Nazareth because of a word called Nazareo, but that actually meant that. I don't remember what it means. Mark, what was the meaning of that?
So it kind of relates to Old Testament prophecy that related to that perhaps the Messiah would be a Netzer.
Yeah. Or the branch of the branch.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so they
Which
took
means
Netzer from Nazareth, and
so the word literally means that maybe there's a tie to David.
Right.
But that not necessarily the prophecy was that the Messiah would be from Nazareth.
Right.
And so the New Testament read that into it.
Twist it to make it do that, but yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, the reason why I'm showing this is because we went through the whole life of Jesus. And guys, I promise I have a point in here. It's not only to show our beautiful covers.
This is great.
Yeah, here we have this that is something that we actually know that there was a John. We know that Jesus went there, no, not Jesus, but we know that people went there. So the idea of Jesus going there is not far-fetched. Obviously, all the idea that, the beam came from the heavens and they said this. I'm going to let you go, David, just after I say this. Okay. We know that people thought that John was actually the Messiah himself. So that's another reason why this story fits so well of Jesus going there and him saying, no, this is the real Messiah, not me. which could be part of the tale. But now, David.
Yeah, I just want to add on to that. It's very obvious now, looking backwards on it, that John the Baptist's cult was originally not part of Christianity at all, but its own rival group. And we actually have a document that has debates between John the Baptist's followers and Christians saying, no, John's the Messiah. No, Jesus is the Messiah. Here's the thing, too, also. I don't know if there was a real John the Baptist or if he was just as mythical as Jesus. But if I had to put my money on just one of them, I would put it on John, because there's slightly better evidence for John. Not a lot, and it's not great, but slightly better than Jesus. And one part of that is the fact that John the Baptist shows up in all the Gospels. And I think you could make an argument that Christianity may have began as a spin-off of John the Baptist's cult.
But
we
I've
don't
heard
know.
that
We
there's
don't know
more
anything
evidence for
a little bit more. But I think it's really interesting that John shows up in all the Gospels, even though they don't agree with what his relationship is to Jesus. Were they complete strangers? Were they first cousins? Did they like each other? Were they rivals? It's very funny that throughout all the Gospels, you see run-ins between John's followers and Jesus, or Jesus's followers. So it's
that
really,
just made me think.
Obvious there's this Cold War going on that you still see the bones of in the Gospels.
You made me think about this, that it really does seem that whole little that little episode where Jesus is being baptized and the word from up above says, you are my son, today I conceive you, or whatever. That just seems like a pissing contest between him and John the Baptist, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, there's lots of ways that it can be interpreted. Robert Bryce had a theory that, and he wasn't trying to argue that this is what certainly happened, but he said, there's an interesting thing. Okay, this is what he said. We know that the Gospels are myths about Jesus. They're allegories about Jesus. What if Jesus is an allegory for John the Baptist? And it's one of those things. The first time I heard it, I thought, "Oh, that's crazy." But the more I think about it, but it would explain a lot of things. And
I was going to quote that from the chat. Michael, he says, Bob Prince thinks that Jesus might be this morphing variation of John turning to Jesus.
Yeah. Well,
I love the chat today.
If we look at the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of Lucas, the first 2 chapters of that are all about John the Baptist. And the parts of that story where you have things of Jesus, if you take them out, they make more sense of the story. And he spends so much more time talking about John the Baptist than he does about Jesus's birth. It's really fascinating that
doesn't Josephus also. Josephus talks more about John the Baptist than he does about Jesus.
And that's one of the lines of evidence that I say, okay, that's probably not a forgery. Even though when he does talk about John the Baptist, there's this theological babble where you say, because John baptized for the remission of sins. It's like, a Jew would not care about any of this. It's clearly a Christian writing. But the fact is,
chat. Oh, yeah?
Well, I was going to say, the fact is, we have Christians complaining that Josephus mentioned John the Baptist, but that he didn't mention Jesus. And that's
weird, right?
Yeah.
Dear chat, as you realize, I'm showing you these beautiful covers because I'm trying to defend how historically true Jesus could be. We knew that when he was born, it's totally BS. Yeah, no question about that. I thought that here we were going to have some extra historical information. Boom! David and Mark destroyed me right away. Let's see with my next piece of evidence, sir.
Oh, no.
Oh, no, not this one. This one...
it's
fun, but actually, we could talk about this one because this is when he goes to the temple and turns water into wine. Both miracles. But when he goes into the temple, the most, or what I've heard, once again, I could be wrong here, is that the only reason why Jesus was able to enter into the temple and start beating up people was because he had his own army, because he was trying to make his army to go against the Roman Empire. Because otherwise, all the security inside the temple would have kicked him out.
Right? So he was
Mhm.
either this one-man kung fu army of death, or
Yeah.
or he had an army, and it's like, okay, if he brought an army, certainly people would have noticed that. It's like you can't have it both ways.
Mhm.
Either
Mhm.
was one man, and and he did the impossible, or it couldn't have been possible, so he must have done this, but nobody noticed.
Mhm.
And of course,
I-
John's gospel has that happening the first week of Jesus' career. In all the synoptics, it's the last week of his career, and that's what gets him in trouble. It's
Mm.
very funny.
and
How he
not to
just
mention too that his cause was, I think, ludicrous, because I
yeah,
think that there is enough, like, the whole changing of the money, that was a biblical
yeah,
thing. Like, that was part of what
exactly.
they were supposed to do.
They were
You
exactly. They
know,
were doing. They were following the rules.
They're-
Yeah.
exactly.
What's another crazy thing about this? And it just talks about how Jesus' story in the gospel makes no sense. The Pharisees, they hate him in the gospels, but in real life, Pharisees would have loved somebody like Jesus. They hated the guys in the temple just as much as Jesus does in the gospel. And there's a great verse that says something about, oh, Jesus, he didn't teach like the scribes and the Pharisees. He taught in his own way. It's like, no, he taught just like the Pharisees, because he's ripping off the Pharisees. Several things he has to say, those were actually what the Pharisees were saying. So it's very funny that by the time the Gospels were being written, the Pharisees were obviously a rival to the Christians, but in real life, they would have loved somebody like Jesus. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And there is something. There is another story from. I don't remember who's the apologetic who did that video, but I know that it was on YouTube. There's some apologetic guy was saying like, "Oh, well, maybe Jesus did not actually run over and start hitting the guys on the temple, whatever.
Yeah.
Maybe what he did was opening the gate for the cattle come out, and they made all the mess."
Yeah, sure.
Like, oh my.
It's so funny they have to like bend over backwards to make sense of these things that happen. And it's like, you have to do that for every single thing in his life from start to finish. It's like, well, maybe it didn't happen just like that. And it's like, yeah, maybe it didn't. Maybe it didn't happen at all.
Maybe they have it at all.
No.
Okay, the next evidence, obviously. Oops, what happened? Here it is. There it is. This is the woman, the whale, beautiful woman
So
that we have
pretty.
there. I was just going to mention this, that this is the typical, oh yeah, but the places that they mention, they are real places, so why don't you believe that? It's like, and I always say, yeah, Spider-Man is it happens in a real place, New York. That doesn't mean that Spider-Man is real. I don't know if Mark, Alma, there is something you want to mention about this. Remember when we read it, it was really quick, so let's go with the next.
The jumping angel.
Yeah, the jumping angel. This was just part of the same thing. There was they had this idea that there was a place where an angel was always jumping, and a blind guy couldn't get there, so Jesus healed him instead of the angels. Silly stuff. More of the same. Jesus teaching in parables, obviously. We'll get that.
I love these pictures.
This one is an important one. This one is when he faces Legion. And I remember that when we were reading it, Mark mentioned how there was a parallel between, the demons entering into pigs, and when Odysseus loses his army to Circe, who turns them into pigs. Yeah. But here we started talking about how stories, get similar, and you cannot say that they copy each other, but they take strong inspirations. Like Odysseus that had the wind of this wind god inside the bag. So when he's sleeping, the people open it and the wind comes out and a storm starts, and he has to go and close. They wake him up, so he has to go and close the bag. With Jesus is the same. Jesus is sleeping. There is a storm. They have to go wake him up. He goes outside and he shouts at the storm, and the storm stops. So I had the idea. Oh, yes, sir.
Oh, I was just gonna say, have you read Dennis MacDonald's book? He's got 2 books talking about Greek influences on the Gospels. Very, very interesting stuff.
Also, recently we were talking with Mark regarding the Jonas, the book of Jonas.
Gotcha.
And how they also have that. They also have that part where they say, "Oh, you know what? There is a big storm. We're about to die, but there is one guy sleeping it off." somewhere. Like, we have to bring it and wake him up, even though they're like we're all going to die, but he's sleeping.
1 second, dear
There we
Wes,
go.
can we have Mark in big screen for a while because he has some very interesting books that I would like to see from him.
Let me.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you
this
have
was
to
just one of those. He does it for the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah.
There's another good one too. Mythologizing Jesus from
Oh, I
Jewish
haven't read that
teacher
one.
to epic hero.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And then someone mentioned Mark
That's the one.
5.
Yeah.
This one talks about the Gospel of Mark and the Homeric
Yeah.
epics.
And
So,
I've read
yeah.
that one. Oh, called Do the Gospels Imitate Homer, which is worth reading too.
By the way, Alma, can you show my first presentation? Because now that we're mentioning books, guys, I think there are some good writers out there who you should go and check. Here we have an interesting book that I would recommend, Jesus Mything in
That
Action.
book does look
I
pretty
like
cool.
the writer. What?
It does look pretty awesome. Yeah.
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 I don't know. You may like or may not like the guy, but his book is very strong. So go and read it, people.
Yep.
That
Yep.
and Nailed. So.
Yeah, Nailed is a good introduction to the whole thing. But Jesus Mything in Action, it's actually 3 books, and they all talk about more of the evidence. Nailed kind of says, well, this is the top 10 ways that this story could not have happened the way it says it is. And Jesus Mything in Action talks more about, and this is where we think it could have come from. It talks about Jesus in the Gospels, Jesus in the New Testament, Jesus outside of the Bible. It's
the volume 1 thing there scares me a little bit. But dear Alma, can we go with the next presentation, please? Because here I have the final coffin to your mythical Jesus, David. Alma, the next presentation. No, the other one, the second one, the covers. There, thank you, Alma, love you. So, sir, did you know that when Jesus is throwing those pigs into the ocean, he's actually referring to a specific Roman legion whose symbol was a pig, no, a boar? Therefore, there you have it, historical real Jesus, David. Or what do you have to say against that strong evidence?
Evidence of something for sure. Yeah. That kind of thing is fascinating. And it's like, it's kind of which came first, this event or this literary interpretation of it, you know?
Are you trying to say that this could just be a tale of a group of people who really disliked the Roman Empire and was using this story to say that we, the Hebrew, are superior to them? Come on.
You know, that's the thing of it is, that's one possibility, but we don't know. I mean, that's I find it very compelling, but there's other stories in there that that only make sense as allegories of something in the Hebrew scriptures. Who knows?
Yeah, I do. Go ahead, David.
In almost every case, it couldn't happen literally the way they say it happened. You know.
There, David, there is a little bit of stream in your lag. If you could repeat that.
Sure. The one thing to keep in mind is for any story you have about Jesus, usually it's impossible to happen the way the Bible says it happened as a historical event. Like, for instance, his trial and his execution. There's just so many things wrong with everything from top to bottom. It makes no sense historically or even as a literary story. There's all these plot holes, but they all make perfect sense as allegories for like Yom Kippur or the Jewish nation becoming the Christian nation. You know, them losing their inheritance and it going to the Christians, that kind of thing. We see that from start to finish. Oh no, I think we've lost our Alma. She'll be back.
I'm still here.
Oh,
just
you're
that
here.
my camera is going nuts.
Yeah, I was saying that she's just glitching a little bit. Mark?
So Tell, I do want to add because one of the criticisms that we hear sometimes is that, are you not just, doing parallelomania, right?
Right.
You're seeing all these things.
Yeah.
And I do want to say that there is something like, if you read Dennis MacDonald's work, he will explain to you that there's this thing called mimesis, and it was a literary genre where this was the sort of thing they did in antiquity. They would take older and more ancient myths,
and reboot them. Yeah,
rework them, and it was not for the purposes of trying to just imitate, like we're gonna plagiarize. No,
right.
Because in fact, that would be kind of dumb. You want to be more profound. You want to be more spiritual. So you're going to add more layers to it. Yeah. And so this was the sort of thing. Mimesis was a thing. Emulatio is the Latin terminology as well. And so there is a precedence, if you will, of literary works in antiquity where this sort of thing took place, and very likely, perhaps that's what went on in this story in particular.
Yeah, and I think you can expand that for all the stories about Jesus. You can see that they're taking things from the Hebrew Scriptures, and like Mark does it and doesn't say he's doing it. Matthew copies Mark and then says, "And this was done because the prophet said so and so or such and such." And sometimes he just makes up prophecies that aren't there, and sometimes he gets them wrong. But he's still acknowledging that this is an allegory for this particular passage in the Hebrew Bible. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, guys. The next point is, that Jesus was actually pretty xenophobic. There is a story of this woman who goes and asks for help, and he calls her a dog, that she was less than a dog, and she had to beg him for his healing powers and all of that stuff. Obviously, the healing part didn't happen. But can we... Oh, yes, David? I was just going to say, can we say that Jesus was kind of a real guy who was an xenophobic asshole and stuff like that?
Well, yeah, clearly in that story, he's a xenophobic asshole. But it's the same thing like the story of him cursing the fig tree because this fig tree is out of season, so it didn't give him figs. It's like when you look at that story, he sounds like an idiot and just a mistaken dude. And it's like, well, that was a dick move, killing this poor helpless tree. But it's like, even though that story makes no sense, as an allegory, when the tree is the Jewish people and they bore no fruit because I guess the Jews weren't ready for it, but now the Christians are. These are all messages that they're saying, yeah, God reached out to the Jews and they smacked him down. So now all those blessings are going to go to the Christians. Stories like that make sense from an allegorical point of view. But they just make him look bad. And it's funny, the evangelists aren't worried about making him look bad. Isn't it funny? Especially Mark's first gospel. He's clearly not God in the beginning. He's just a normal human being like us. And at his baptism, that's when God says, "Today you are my son. I'm going to adopt you as my son." And it's not until he goes all the way through his story, obeys all the way to death and beyond, that God raises him up and exalts him to the position of his son and savior. But he starts out in Mark, the first gospel, the gospel everybody else copied from, as a normal human being. And that's why it makes sense that as soon as he gets baptized, what's the first thing that happens? He gets tempted. He gets tempted in the wilderness. It makes no sense if he was God for Satan to tempt him for 40 days in the wilderness. Like, what are you going to tempt God with? Nothing. It's like he shows him all the kingdoms of the earth. Big whoops. This is God we're talking about. But if this was a human guy, that temptation makes sense. In the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus is terrified that he's going to die horribly and says, if it's okay with you, God, take this cup of suffering away from me, but not my will, but yours. I'll do it if you want me to. It's like that story has so much pathos. If we're talking about a human guy who God's asking to just die horribly for people's sins, and it makes no sense if he's just a god slumming. So
cool. Anything else to say, Mark?
I think Dr. Kip Davis has a good point. If you can add his comment, he says, but the fulfillments of prophecy in the Second Temple Judaism were not allegories. Perhaps people believed most of this stuff. If this stuff happened, we see the same thing in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
But in first century Judaism, anything that would have happened, there was a group of Jews who were saying, "Oh yeah, we always said this was going to happen." Judaism was never so diverse as in the first century.
I insist. The chat today is on fire. I love it. Good.
Yeah.
I'm going to just advance really quickly with the next, because this one we just talked about how violent Jesus was. I don't think there is much value about that. I don't know if you want to mention something about this event. I mean, it has some symbolism, but I don't think it represents much of a historical Jesus. The one when he's washing the feet of the guys.
Yeah, that's another example brought up by Dr. Dennis Miller, where he points out another epic, I forget which one, but it's the Euryclea, with the king that's returning home, Hector.
After the Peloponnesian War, or after the
10-year war.
Yeah.
So he comes back, but he comes back under the guise of some poor man or something, because he doesn't want to be recognized. He's heard rumors or reports that his wife is being courted by all these men, so he wants to come in and just do something else. And so, but then there's this one person, this woman that comes to wash his feet, I believe. And in a very similar way, she she finds a birthmark, because apparently she was also his babysitter or something. So she sees a birthmark, and she recognized him as king.
Yeah.
And so Hector sort of made a deal about that, like, you'll be known for this as well. So it's a similar scenario in the gospel too, where there's this recognition that she knows, and only she knows who's in the presence of the Christ, and so that she'll be known for. And so her name, there's a literary connection there with Euryclea, and then literally how it reads in the Greek New Testament, in that little section. So it's really interesting. I think he's got a point there.
I do too. He makes some really interesting parallels, and some are stronger than others, but the fact that he's got so many of them, it really is compelling. And it would make sense, because the guys who wrote the Gospels were not just aw shucks, fishermen, and they were clearly educated, Greek-speaking guys, and some of them didn't know a lot about Judaism. Some of them, obviously, like Mark, for instance, makes a lot of mistakes about basic Judaism that nobody who lived at the time would have. And Matthew, who's clearly from a Jewish Christian sect, knows a lot more about Judaism and corrects his mistakes. Luke is a Gentile, and part of the reason we know that is because he copies Mark's mistakes without making any correction. So yeah, it makes perfect sense that these guys would be very much influenced by Homer and by Greek education. Yeah, there's no way it couldn't have been. It could have been otherwise.
Yeah, and he does have a criteria, and like Dr. Kip Davis, he also put a comment there that not all of Dennis' parallels are that strong. I think he's right. There are some that are not as strong, but it's not parallelomania. Gnostic Informant has another good comment there. Says the text. Actually, it's the one earlier.
Which one? This one?
Oh yeah.
There was another one
from
earlier.
Gnostic Informant? No?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, I will read the one from Gnostic Informant.
The one that one. Yeah, parallelomania is Jesus had a tunic, Romulus had a tunic, Jesus had disciples, Horus had this, like zeitgeist kind of stuff.
Yeah, and it's like during the the 19th century, there was all kinds of things where there's that one book about the all these other crucified messiahs, and the things just don't add up. Either they're making things up, or they're seeing things that aren't even there for the first place, or parallelomania made a lot more sense in the 19th century because there was a lot of that going on. But I think we can safely say, this is too much just be coincidence. There's the story in Josephus about this guy named Jesus ben Ananias in Jerusalem during the Jerusalem War with Rome, where there's all these parallels to our Jesus in the Gospels. And it would be very weird if it just so happened that generations after Jesus, this guy, his life paralleled him in so many interesting ways. And again, it's not a perfect fit, but then again, we're talking about people. It's an influence. It's not a copy, cookie cutter copying job. Yeah. So absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, Teo.
Maybe if I didn't mute myself to type, you would have heard me what I was saying. Okay, let me start again. Now we're reaching the final part of the Jesus tale where we definitely are going to agree that many of these things could have never happened. I mean, he was looking at himself being crucified in future and he was totally okay with it. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Here we have the Last Supper, which actually it's quite interesting because they really go to a family, took them hostage, start eating their food, and then they have their Last Supper because they didn't have anything. And the Bible says that, yeah, go there to that house and tell them that you're doing this in the name of Jesus. I don't remember the name had accused there, or he said he was the Messiah. I don't remember. And it's so
Tell
weird.
them the master needs it.
Sorry?
Tell them the master has need of it, is what I told him to say. Yes.
Thank you. I had totally forgotten it.
The boss says
just like the donkeys.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The donkeys.
All right.
Depends who you read.
They stole the donkeys, they stole the food, and they are during this is the end of Friday. So this is when the Easter starts for them. They start eating the food of these people. And then Judas, that here is being represented by Alma, decides to go for a walk, apparently to buy the bread that they didn't have, in a day where everything is closed. Yeah. And then mysteriously we have they somehow bring the guards, they take him to prison, they go and wake up in the middle of the night, this poor guy, Pilatus, they make him judge him in the middle of the night. Look at that handsome Pilatus over there.
And I love the way they describe Pontius Pilate because he was nothing like this in real life. He's like, oh, but I find no fault with him. I mustn't kill him. It's like, no, he was a monster. He did not.
He would not have cared at all.
Not cared at all. Yeah.
He would have killed the guys who woke him up.
What's that?
He would have killed the guys who woke him up in that case.
Exactly, right?
Do you dare to? Yes. So very silly all the thing.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because like the story of his trial and execution, that's where things really just go off the rails as far as historically this could not have happened this way at all. Especially it's like just by Jewish law, they didn't need the Romans to execute him. They could execute anybody they wanted, and they would have done it by stoning him to death the way Jewish law required them to do. It's like.
Wait, but weren't they under the Roman Empire rules by then, so they didn't have their right because the Romans kind of had their right?
They were a client kingdom. They are a client kingdom, so there was lots of things that they still were under their own authorization to do. That's another mistake where they said, "Oh yeah, we can't do it. Only the Romans can do it." It's like, nah, that's not true. Not true at all.
That's
also, it would be like that scene, The Life of Brian, where everybody's just like. He says Jehovah, and everybody starts throwing the stone.
Yes, yeah, that's it. It's like, and when you read the Gospel of John, it's like, well, did they have a shortage of stones? Because right out of the gate, he's saying he's the Son of God, and he doesn't care who knows it. It cracks me up.
Yeah, and that's something else too, that each gospel has its own version of Jesus. Like this whole harmonized understanding of Jesus Christ. Has got to go, because if you're critical about each one, you're going to notice some very stark differences.
Yeah, and
I think that's
especially
important.
The folks who say, well, the details are so convincing, it must have happened. Well, if you look at the details of, like, say, for instance, what John says happened in the last week of Jesus' life and what all the other three said happened in the last, it's like, yeah, these don't match up at all. And Luke has him doing two trials, one before Herod and one before Pilate, and the same thing happens in both. It's so ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. And again, these are just the four gospels that made the cut. We've got other gospels out there that were even crazier. The Gospel of Peter was so much more popular than the Gospel of Mark, and yet it's crazy buckets. It's got a talking cross. It's got a 500-foot tall Jesus. It's wild.
And let's not forget Paul. Paul's got a different resurrected Jesus.
Yep. Yeah, I talk about how there's different Pauls in my most recent talk.
Oh yeah.
And there's the Paul we love, the real Paul, and the super Paul that Luke makes up, and whatever there's an overlap between what Paul says happened and what Luke says happened, they say completely opposite things.
Maybe you love him. I was going to say that the thing of the...
Oh. Look, I found
There it is. There it is. Yeah. That's one of my favorite scenes in the whole movie. Yep.
Speed it up, and it's like 5 seconds before they do.
And I want to make this very clear: no one's going to stone anyone, even if they do say Jehovah. And then, of course, they all kill him.
Jehovah.
Right. And of course, they're all women. That's hilarious. Oh, I love these guys so much.
Interesting. We have in the chat somebody saying that actually the Romans would have allowed or disallowed as far as religious motivated execution would have been concerned.
Sorry, what are they saying?
Regarding the way the Romans would have allowed or disallowed as far as religious motivated execution would have been concerned. This is not factually correct. Interesting. I think we could check that later. Because actually, one of my points in here that I wanted to show, dear Alma, if you can show us the cover again.
Which one? This one?
No. This one. I like this because we have Jesus at night. I think that in the next one is also 1 second. This one, but no, I will use the one with the zombies because we're not going to be talking about the zombies for obvious reasons. But the thing that Jesus was crucified was, for me, like the only evidence that this could have happened, because nothing makes sense. But yeah, Jesus, being a guy who goes against the empire, he's going to be judged by the Roman Empire, and he's going to suffer the same punishment that everybody else, being crucified as the loser that he is because he tried a failed revolt against the empire. That was the strongest reason for me to believe that, Jesus could have been a real guy. Of course, there was no eclipse when he died. The sky didn't darken. There were no earthquakes. There were no zombies. All of that is just magical stuff. But he could have been just crucified because after the temple thing, if he actually had an army that allowed him to do that, it makes sense that he felt so powerful that he was like, and now let's take the Romans out of here. And the Romans answered, and he met his destiny.
Sure. And this is the thing. If you twist it enough, you can kind of make sense. Like, well, okay, he couldn't have done that, but he could have had an army. But then we're back to the point of, and somehow nobody noticed that he brought an army into the temple. It's like, we have no eyewitnesses to any of these amazing things that happen. So it's this kind of a catch-22. Either he did all these amazing things, but nobody noticed for over 100 years, or he didn't do anything, and yet as soon as he's crucified, you've got this small cult that appears not just in Jerusalem, not just in the Galilee, but scattered all over the Roman Empire. And it's like that paradox for me was one of the first things that, like, okay, something's really wrong here. And again,
David, you make some very good points, almost as if you knew what you're talking about and you had a book about this. Quite interesting.
Well, there you go. And honestly, if I'm wrong about any of this, let me know. I'd love to be less wrong about any of this. It's just the more I look into it, the less it looks like any of this is anything but an allegory. And again, in the new book, one thing I want to point out is it's not just Jesus that has this problem. Same thing with Moses. Same thing with just about everybody in the Old Testament. Same thing with Muhammad. Same thing with the Buddha and Confucius and Lao Tzu. You know, over and over and over again, we start seeing the same patterns for how these major world religions begin. And it's just fascinating that they seem so different until you take a big picture, and then they all start to look alike.
Yeah,
they seem to develop in the same ways. Yeah,
I will talk a little bit about Mahoma later, but now I want to quote Dr. Kip.
Sorry to interrupt, but I have to get ready for Women's Atheist Unload. So thank you so much for having me here.
Thanks you, Alma. You're the best.
Have a good day. Bye
You're
bye.
amazing.
Take care.
So busy. Now I'm just left with the dudes. Terrible party.
Oh, dude, sausage
Okay.
party.
So Dr. Kip was saying, we have conflicting evidence that saying Jehovah's name in the first century Palestine was blasphemy.
Well, another thing is
Interesting.
we should keep in mind that calling yourself the Messiah, there in the Gospels, that's the blasphemy, and that wasn't blasphemy to declare yourself Messiah. We had lots of messiahs in the first century. We had lots of messiahs in the second century, and they were perfectly fine with that. So no matter how you slice it, whichever direction you come up in that story, it just doesn't make sense. Historically, I mean.
Good.
And yet it all makes perfect sense, point by point by point, as an allegory. So something to keep in mind, as you know, whether you're talking about mimesis or you're talking about Jewish midrash or Pesher, you know, you definitely get the feeling that they're assembling these stories out of scriptural scraps. And we know that the Gospels, the guys who wrote the Gospels, were mining like the letters of Paul for names and characters, and taking things he describes, like that what Paul calls the Lord's Supper, and turning it into the Last Supper.
Okay, this is getting very interesting. Now that Alma left us, I'm going to leave you with these two beautiful Jesus out there. I like the handsome one with glasses, but up to you to decide which one do you prefer. And you decide which one represents the real Jesus and which one the mythical one. I really like the very strong points that David is making. Mark, I want to hear more about you. What about you after this conversation? Are you tending to go more to the mythical Jesus? Are you staying with the historical one? What does Apostate of Mind has to say on this topic?
I think that I would classify myself as perhaps kind of a secular historical or historicist.
Yeah.
You know, in the sense that I'm not gonna deny that there was a Jesus that had lived and preached and traveled and had a following, and that perhaps that maybe he thought that he was something, but beyond that, I'm not quite so sure if I can put my trust on what many of the historical events that the Gospels are claiming, or the whole New Testament for sure. And most certainly, I reject any and all supernatural claims from any of those writings too. So,
the nice thing I think the only thing that makes this debate worth having, because really, honestly, whether there was a Jesus or not, Christianity makes no sense, and it won't make any more sense if he was a real guy or not. But what I love about having this discussion is everything we learn in this back and forth between the historicists and the mythicists shows us that the Christian Jesus, everything we know about that guy has nothing to do with anybody who actually lived in the first century. And I think that's what makes this debate worth happening. Otherwise, it's just kind of a random historical, almost a hobby, arguing whether he really existed or not.
Gotcha.
But when you can call the bluff of anybody who says, "Oh, I know how Jesus thinks and wants you to act and wants to tell you how to vote," you can say, "Yeah, Jesus don't say that. Jesus doesn't say that."
That's the interesting point that I like to take from this, that people, they don't even know how Jesus thought. Actually, you can even quote Jesus from the Bible and they will say that that's not what he meant. Because when they ask Jesus, what do people have to do in order to be saved? Sell everything, give it to the poor and follow me. But that was only for for his followers back at the time, not for us Christian real followers of Jesus.
Yeah. So it's funny just see the dance that goes around when when they try to explain what was a naked boy doing at the Garden of Gethsemane. What was that all about? Yeah, very rare you hear preachers talk about that, for instance.
Yep. Guys, it has been a very interesting conversation today. It was awesome. I love having both of you in here. Please promote your channels and give us your final words after this.
Sure. Mark, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. So please subscribe, Apostate of Mind. And, there we just take a very critical and scholarly approach to any and all claims from religion. We dig deep into Bible stuff and recently we done some great episodes on archaeology with Dr. Kip Davis that had great success.
Yeah.
And I want to thank him. He's in the chat there weighing in. And so, yeah, come and check us out. The last thing I want to mention, too, which I thought you were going to get into, Teo, when I started talking about biographies, ancient biographies, and what the Gospels really were.
Yeah.
But I certainly now would, if I could just simply summarize, I reject the notion that the Gospels were histories or like eyewitness accounts or biographies of some sort that resemble anything that we understand as today, in today's day and age, as an eyewitness report, like after a crime, someone doing a deposition or something. Most certainly this was not the case. And I follow what Dr. Barterman teaches about how perhaps the Gospels were more of like within the genre of a Greco-Roman biography, which is a little something different.
Yeah.
Where historical events and things like that are not as crucial, perhaps. The chronology of how things are mentioned in a Greco-Roman biography is not the point. The point is perhaps the lessons that the character learned through those events.
The uplifting point. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so they're not to be taken as like, oh, this is historical stuff, like we're reading, an actual historian.
Oh, Teo, we could talk about just that for another hour or so, because there's so much about early Christianity and the mystery religions too, where you get this is a great story, and for the average Christian or the average Mithras, it's a nice story, but for the guys who are really educated and know what they're talking about, they realize, oh no, this has deeper meaning. It has a spiritual meaning.
Trust me, I want both of you talking about this topic later on, so we will have an next one if you agree to that. Yeah. So, David, where can people find you?
Probably easiest to find me on Facebook. You can also find me at davidfitzgerald.org. And again, you can email me at everybodylovesdave@gmail.com if you have questions or want to discuss any of this further. And I hope I'll be able to see you guys soon. The new book is called Playing God and Evolutionary History of World Religion, and that's going to be coming out this summer. And as soon as I can get it through all the formatting and editing and whatnot, jump through all those hoops.
As soon as you're ready, I hope you give me an interview to have it translated to Spanish. For everybody awesome. For everybody who wants to know more about, who wants to hear more of Alma, she's going to be right now in Women's Unload Atheist. I think I'm mentioning the name right. Right here, so please follow the channel. Give us your like. If you want to know more about Alma, Mark, and what we do every Sunday, instead of doing evil things, we actually read the Bible at NuestraExperienciaAtea. Sadly, it's only in Spanish, but hey, if you want to practice your Spanish, go ahead. Women Atheists Unload. Yeah, I think I was right about that. Maybe not. Thank you so much to all our patrons. Thank you so much to our public today. They were amazing. I love reading you all, and I learned a lot of stuff today. So thanks, everybody, and see you soon. Have a wonderful time.
Mil gracias.